Welcome back, everyone, for another deep dive. Looks like we're diving into some listener feedback today.
Oh, fun.
It's on a student presentation, and it looks like it's on, let's see, neurological diseases,
Okay.
specifically ALS.
I got it.
And I have to say, just look this over. It's pretty dense, so I'm really glad you're here to help me break this down.
Absolutely. It looks like it could be pretty challenging,
Yeah,
but I think we can handle it.
and it looks like the listener's interested in the science of ALS, of course,
Mhm.
but also how to actually explain it to someone.
Interesting.
So how to make sure people actually understand what you're talking about when you're talking about something as complicated as ALS.
I see. So not just like the content,
Right.
but the communication of the content.
Exactly. And the professor's feedback actually uses a really interesting analogy.
Okay.
He compares giving too much information at once
Okay.
to like feeding a child a multi-course meal in one go.
I like that analogy.
Yeah.
Makes sense.
Instead, he thinks you should break the information down into like these manageable,
Right,
digestible
yeah.
pieces so it's easier to understand.
Makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. So what do you think, how does this apply
Yeah.
to this particular presentation about ALS?
Well, it looks like the student did a really good job diving into the different types of ALS,
Okay.
but the professor's feedback was basically that
Yeah.
it got a little too detailed too fast.
Oh, okay.
And he wanted the students to simplify, especially when talking about the
Yeah.
connection between ALS and FTD.
Yeah, FTD, frontotemporal dementia. I
Exactly.
remember reading about that. It's a
Yeah.
really complicated area of research.
Absolutely. And it can be pretty hard to wrap your head around.
Right.
And it seems like the professor's suggestion was to use visuals, like Venn diagram,
Oh, interesting.
to show that connection
Yeah.
between the two conditions.
So people can visualize the overlap.
Exactly.
Yeah, yeah.
And also, he recommended that they highlight certain genes that play a role in both ALS and FTD, like TP43.
Got it. So it's like finding the common thread
Yeah.
that connects them together.
Exactly. And speaking of connections, the source material also mentions misfolded proteins and their role in ALS.
Oh, yeah, misfolded proteins. Can you explain that a little bit?
Absolutely. So we're talking about proteins like SOD1, TDP43, and FUS.
Okay,
These are proteins that can misfold in people with ALS.
got it.
And when they misfold, they basically clump together and form these aggregates,
Oh, I see.
which can cause a lot of damage within cells.
So it's like a wrench in the gears?
Yeah, a good way to think about it.
Yeah.
The professor recommended they kind of explain this process step by step.
Okay.
Maybe pick one protein to focus on and then show
Right.
how it interacts and causes these problems.
So almost like a domino effect of
Big-
things going wrong.
Precisely.
Yeah.
Cell. Yeah, and he even suggested they use visuals to show how these misfolded proteins can disrupt things like axonal transport in motor neurons.
Oh, wow. So it's like a chain reaction of dysfunction,
Exactly.
leading to the symptoms of ALS.
Absolutely. And he really wanted them to make this clear for their audience.
Right. So it's not just theoretical. It's
Yeah.
like actually happening in the body.
Exactly.
So it seems like the professor was really focused on
Oh,
helping the students
yeah,
see the presentation from the audience's perspective,
definitely.
which is really important.
It is. And speaking of seeing things from the audience's perspective, that brings us to
Yeah.
the discussion of diagnosis and treatment
Okay.
in the presentation.
So what did the professor have to say about that?
Well, it seemed like he felt that section was lacking in concrete examples.
Oh, so he wanted them to go beyond just general descriptions.
Exactly.
Yeah.
He wanted them to give very specific examples to make it more real for the audience.
Got it.
So instead of just talking about the challenges of diagnosing ALS in general,
Yeah.
he wanted them to mention things like electromyography and nerve conduction studies.
Right. Those are the actual tests they use
Exactly.
to diagnose ALS.
Yeah, he wanted the audience to really see what that diagnostic process looks like.
Okay. And I imagine the same goes for treatment.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. So what did he say about that?
Well, it seems like the students mentioned riluzole,
Okay.
which is a drug that's used to manage ALS,
Right.
but the professor wanted them to go deeper
Oh,
into the specifics of how it actually works.
but more than just saying it's a treatment.
Right, more than just saying it works.
He wanted to know the mechanism.
Exactly.
So how does riluzole actually work?
Well, it targets a neurotransmitter called glutamate,
Okay.
which plays a really important role in communication between neurons.
Got it.
And in ALS, this glutamate can become overactive,
Okay.
which leads to something called excitotoxicity.
Excitotoxicity, is that?
Yeah, it basically means that the neurons are overstimulated,
Oh, I see.
which causes damage.
Got it.
And riluzole is thought to work by modulating glutamate release.
Oh,
So it kind of turns down the volume.
so it's like a protective mechanism.
Yeah,
Exactly.
the-
neurons.
precisely.
Okay.
And the professor specifically mentioned that he wanted them to discuss riluzol's interaction with sodium channels.
Oh,
And he also
interesting.
wanted them to explain its neuroprotective effects.
Got it. So again, going beyond just the surface level
Yeah, really getting into the details.
and showing how it actually works in the body.
Precisely.
Wow, this is a lot to take in. So what
Mhm.
are like the main takeaways
Yeah.
here, especially when it comes to the professor's feedback?
I think one of the biggest takeaways is that it's crucial to present information
Yeah?
in a way that's both accurate and accessible.
Right.
So we've seen how breaking down those complex concepts
Yeah.
and using visuals strategically
Yeah.
and giving specific examples can make a huge difference in helping people understand.
It's like building a bridge
Yeah.
from the science to the listener's understanding.
I love that analogy. And there's another really important point
Yeah.
that the professor brought up in his feedback. Storytelling. He actually challenged his students to think of the presentation as a play.
Oh, wow, a play.
Yeah, with a beginning, middle, and end.
Oh, interesting.
He wanted them to create a narrative that would draw the audience in.
Okay, so it's not just about presenting facts.
Right.
It's about telling a story
Exactly.
that people can connect with.
And he even suggested incorporating personal anecdotes or real-life examples
That's a great idea.
to illustrate the impact of ALS on patients and families.
That makes it much more real for people.
Exactly.
It's not just a disease, it's something that affects real people.
Absolutely.
So this has been really fascinating. We've learned a lot about the science of ALS
Yeah.
and also the challenges of explaining it in a way that people can understand.
Accepted.
But before we move on,
Yeah.
I'm curious about something.
Okay, what is it?
The source material mentions other potential therapeutic approaches, like gene therapy.
Uh-huh.
But it seems like the professor advised the students to stick to the more established information. Why do you think that is?
Well, I think it comes down to meeting the audience where they're at.
Cool.
Gene therapy is really exciting,
Yeah.
and there's a lot of potential there,
Yeah.
but it's still a relatively new field, and it can get pretty complicated pretty quickly.
Yeah, and you don't want to overwhelm people.
Exactly. You need to build a solid foundation of understanding
Right.
before you start adding those extra layers of complexity.
It's like building a house. You need a strong foundation first.
You got it. And speaking of foundations, let's get back to the professor's feedback on the students' use of visuals.
Okay, yeah. He had a lot to say about that.
He did, and I think there are some valuable lessons we can learn there.
Absolutely. Let's dive back into that.
So, yeah, the professor, he really felt like the slides were too crowded.
Oh, okay.
He actually said he felt lost looking at them. He didn't know where to focus.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, and he mentioned they had too much text.
Yeah, that's a common problem, I think.
It is.
When you're excited about a topic, you want to tell everyone everything at once.
Right, and he said that could make it really hard for the audience to follow.
Yeah, especially with a topic like ALS,
Exactly.
which is already so complicated.
Right, so he recommended a more minimalist approach,
Okay, interesting.
like using highlighting
Oh, okay.
and arrows and animations to kind of guide the audience's attention.
So it's almost like you're creating a visual path.
Yeah, a visual hierarchy
Yeah.
to lead them through the information.
Okay, I like that.
And he suggested using a reveal technique.
A reveal technique. What's that?
So you start with a simplified image,
Okay.
and then as you explain the concepts, you add more details.
Oh, interesting.
So it's like building the picture gradually.
Yeah, so it doesn't overwhelm people.
Exactly. He said this would be really helpful for explaining things like
Yeah.
how protein aggregates form
Oh,
in
right.
ALS.
Yeah, yeah.
So you could start with like a diagram of a healthy neuron. Then you introduce the misfolded protein, show how it starts clumping together,
Yeah.
and then how those clumps disrupt the cell.
Oh, I see. So it's like a step-by-step visual guide.
Exactly. And what's really cool is that he didn't just focus on those
Yeah.
technical aspects of the visuals.
Oh, okay.
He also talked about storytelling.
Storytelling with visuals.
Yeah, he encouraged the students to think of the presentation as a play
Oh, wow.
with a beginning, a middle, and an end.
Interesting.
He wanted them to create a narrative that would pull the audience in.
Okay, so it's not just about showing the facts.
Right.
It's about making them come alive.
Exactly. He even suggested using anecdotes or real-life examples
Oh, that's a good idea.
to show how ALS affects people's lives.
Yeah, to put a human face on the disease.
Exactly.
That's really powerful.
It is, and I think it's something we often forget when
Yeah.
we're talking about science.
We get so focused on the details.
Right, we forget that it's ultimately about people.
And their stories. So, speaking of focusing on details,
Yeah.
the professor also talked about the importance of language.
He did. He really emphasized using precise language.
Oh, yes.
especially when describing scientific concepts.
So no jargon.
Well, he wanted them to avoid using jargon that the audience might not understand.
Right, so it's about finding that balance between
No.
being accurate and being understandable.
Exactly. He encouraged them to define any key terms they used
Okay.
to give specific examples
Yeah.
and to avoid making generalizations.
So it's about being very specific.
Precisely.
And I imagine that applies to the diagnosis and treatment sections as well.
Absolutely. Remember how we talked about the professor wanting specific examples of diagnostic tests?
Yes.
Mm.
Electromyography, nerve conduction studies. Yeah.
Exactly. And he also wanted them to be very precise when explaining how riluzole works.
Okay, so more than just saying it modulates glutamate.
Right. He wanted them to talk about how it interacts with sodium channels
Oh,
and to explain its neuroprotective effects.
So it's about painting a very detailed picture.
Yeah, a complete picture
Yeah.
of how the drug works.
It's like zooming in on the molecular level.
Exactly.
And seeing all the different players involved.
Yeah, and showing how they all work together.
Okay, this is fascinating. It's like a whole new way of thinking about science communication.
It is. And it's something we can all learn from.
Absolutely. So you mentioned earlier that the professor had a question for his students.
Oh, right.
What was it?
He asked them, if you were designing a presentation on ALS for a general audience, what one key message would you want them to take away?
Wow, that's a really good question.
It is.
It really makes you think about what's most important.
Right. What's the essence of what you want to convey?
It's like distilling all that complex information down to one core idea.
Exactly. And it's a question we should all be asking ourselves.
Yeah, whether we're giving a presentation
Yeah.
or writing an article.
Or just talking to someone about ALS.
Right. What's the one thing we want them to remember? This is definitely something I'm going to be thinking about.
Me too. It's a great question to keep in mind.
So this focus on distilling complex information
Yeah.
reminds me of something else the professor talked about,
With that.
the importance of concrete details.
Oh, right. He really wanted them to move away from general descriptions and provide specific examples.
Exactly. It's a theme that runs throughout his feedback.
It does, and I think it's a valuable lesson for all of us.
Yeah, because when we're learning something new,
Yeah.
it's easy to get lost in the big picture.
Right, and sometimes you need those specific details to
Exactly.
really understand what's going on.
It's like the difference between reading a textbook
Yeah.
and having a conversation with an expert.
Exactly. The expert can point you to the most important information.
Yeah, the stuff that really matters.
Precisely.
So, speaking of experts, let's get back to the professor's feedback on the diagnosis and treatment sections.
Okay, sounds good.
I'm curious to hear more about his comments there. Okay, so let's talk more about this idea of being specific when it comes to diagnosis and treatment.
Right. So remember, he wanted them to give examples instead of general statements?
Yeah.
So for diagnosis, he suggested they talk about ruling out other conditions.
Okay.
Because, a lot of things can look like ALS.
Right, so it's not always a straightforward diagnosis.
Exactly. And he wanted them to mention the specific tests.
Yeah?
Like electromyography, where they measure electrical activity in muscles, and nerve conduction studies to see how well the nerves transmit signals.
Right, those are the actual tests they do.
Yeah, and he even suggested they mention specific biomarkers that doctors might look for.
So it's about giving the audience
Yeah.
a real understanding of what the diagnostic process involves.
Exactly, and the same thing goes for the treatment section.
Right. He wanted them to really explain how riluzole works.
Yeah, and he specifically mentioned how it interacts with sodium channels.
Oh.
So it's not just about knowing that it affects glutamate.
Yeah.
It's about understanding the specifics of how it works.
That's really interesting.
And he also wanted them to talk about the potential neuroprotective effects.
Oh, right.
So not just managing symptoms,
Yeah.
but potentially slowing down the progression of the disease.
It's like giving people a sense of hope,
Exactly.
even though there's no cure yet.
Right. There are things that can be done.
And I think this focus on precision really ties back to what we were talking about earlier with the visuals.
It does. He wanted the students to be very specific with their visual aids as well.
Right, to make sure they were clear and easy to understand.
Exactly. Because a confusing visual can be just as bad as
Right.
confusing language.
And he wanted them to tell a story
Yeah.
with those visuals.
He did. And I think that's such an important point.
Yeah, it's not just about showing facts.
Right.
It's about engaging the audience
And making them care.
and making them feel something. So I think, going back to that question the professor asked,
Yeah.
if we were to design a presentation on ALS,
Yeah.
what one key message would we want people to take away?
That's the question, isn't it?
And it's a tough one.
It is.
But I think For me,
Yeah.
I would want people to leave with a sense of hope.
Hope.
Yeah, because as we've discussed, ALS is a devastating disease.
It is.
But there's so much research happening.
There is.
So many brilliant people working on this.
Absolutely.
And I think it's important for people to know that.
Yeah.
To know that there's still reason to be optimistic.
I love that.
Even though there are challenges,
Yeah.
there's also hope for the future.
And that's what makes this deep dive so rewarding, isn't it?
It is.
We get to learn about this complex science.
Yeah.
But we also get to see the human side of it.
The passion, the dedication.
The hope.
It's been a privilege to share this journey with you and with our listeners.
Absolutely.
So until next time,
Yeah.
keep exploring
Keep learning.
and keep diving deep.